Hello everyone, welcome back to our Springboot render series. And in this video, we're going to talk about testing our web applications. So this is going to serve as the last video in our series, and we'll be using JUnit 5 and mock MVC to test the web application that we've been building so far. These are probably the most popular testing frameworks out there today. We'll only talk about testing our controller and helper classes, but the techniques that we talk about in this video should be able to be applied to other classes as well. So as with other videos, I won't do a deep dive into testing. Rather, I'll just provide you enough information to get you started. So we're going to do 3 types of tests. First, we're going to do a unit test on a helper class that has no dependencies. Then we're going to do a test on a REST controller. And then finally, we're going to test an endpoint on a controller that returns a template. So let's get started. All right, so we're on our desktop here, and there's a few things I want you to note first off. Go into our pom.xml file, and we need to make sure that we have the Springboot starter test as a dependency. This is going to give us all of the functionality that we need in order to conduct our tests. The second thing is I've added a few more Java files here. The first one I want to point your attention to is this product.java. So this product.java is just maybe a helper file for a lot of maybe some functionalities that we're writing. This is by no means a good class design, but this will help us kind of get the point across. So we have this byProduct method that you see that we have a product which has a unit price and an inventory, and whenever I want to buy a product, I pass in how much I want to buy, and I'm going to check for whether this number is negative, and I'm also going to check for whether or not this inventory is greater than the number that, or sorry, is less than the number that I want to buy, and in which case I want an illegal state exception that I have negative inventory. Otherwise, I'm just going to subtract the number that I'm buying from the inventory as well as return the unit price times the number. This is how much ideally a person would have to pay for this product. All right, so let's say I want to generate some tests for this. We'll go to source action and generate tests. And we're going to go into this folder, and we're going to generate a Java file called product test. And right now I'm just going to select none of them, but ideally you would probably want to test all of your methods. So this is what we get. And you can see that we've created a product test.java file inside of our test folder. All right, so to save ourselves a little bit of time, I'm just going to copy over a test that I've written already. And I'll show you a few things about this. So the first thing we want to import is a bunch of assertions. So these assertions come from JUnit. This is the assertion library associated with JUnit that allows us to be able to assert whether things are equal. And also there's a fail method that we can call to fail a test right away. There's also an annotation called test that I'm bringing in here. So anytime we annotate a method with the word test, we're really saying that this is a test that we need to run. And you'll see that automatically we will be given this run button, which allows us to be able to run each of the tests. Now, if you take a look at the first one, we have the product. We're creating a new product, and we're assigning it as 12.5, and we have an inventory of 10. And so we want to buy 2 of these, which hopefully is going to give us the cost of 2 times 12.5, as well as after the fact, we have 8 as our remaining inventory. So I'm going to test both of these things at the same time. I'm also then going to buy another 3 of these products and assert the same thing. So basically what a test does is it tries to run the method from top to bottom. If it succeeds from running top to bottom, that is a passing test. If on the other hand, there's an assertion that fails at some point, it's going to halt the program, and that would be a failing test, and it would tell us where is the failing test. So maybe I'll show you that in 1 second. The second test I want to create here is purchase a negative product. So you see here that if I pass in a negative argument for the num, this is going to give me an illegal argument exception, and it's going to say negative value. So in the second test, I will try to buy the product as a negative value, and then if it makes it past this point, it's going to fail right away. So I want to fail the test if it fails to catch this exception. Okay, so if it ever gets past this statement, I'm going to fail right away. But ideally, we want it to catch the illegal argument exception, and here, what we want to do is assert equals the negative value for the get message. So again, we want the message to be negative value. So we just want to test whether we're getting to that endpoint of the method. All right, so that looks pretty good, and you can imagine that there are other tests that we can write for illegal state exception as well, so I'll leave that as an exercise for you. And so if we run this, we'll see that both tests are passing. Okay, so both are passing, but at any point, if we, for example, test the cost for, let's say, 4 times 12.5, this is obviously wrong. So if we run this test, it will give us the feedback for what we were expecting and what the actual value that we're seeing is. Okay, so you can definitely play around with that. I'm going to change it back to our previous value just for the sake of having all our tests be passing. Okay, so that is the first type of test, which is a very basic test. This is just testing a class that doesn't really have any server activities associated with it. So now let's take a look at the second type of test that I want to show you. And here I want to show you that under models, we have a post.java. So this post.java is just a class that consists of a post that has the field's title as well as content. This is maybe a blog post, so the title would be the title of the blog post, and content would obviously be the content of the blog post. And this is just a very basic class with some getters and setters. And so I'm going to write this posts controller, which has two endpoints. One, which is adding a post. Adding a post has a request body associated with it. So ideally what we're sending in the request body is the title attribute as well as a content attribute. I'm going to make a new post out of that. And then over here, you can see that we also have view post. So all the posts that we have currently, view post is going to get a result for all of the posts that we currently have. So again, I'll write a really quick test for this, and I want to again remind you that this is not the best class design. This is just really just something quick that I threw together to show you the functionality of JUnit and here mock MVC as well. So I want you to see that this is a REST controller, because really what we're sending back are JSON objects. So we're sending back the new post. The new post is really an object, is a post object that we're sending back, this blog post object that we're sending back. And similarly, in this posts that we're sending back, you'll notice posts is actually a list of posts. Okay, so this is actually a list that we're sending back in JSON form. All right, so this is a REST controller because really we're sending back information that's encoded in JSON. All right, so again, let's generate some tests for this. Now again, we're going to be asked which ones do we want to test. Ideally, we want to click on all of them, but since I've already written some tests for this, I'll just copy everything over. And let's take a look at this. So we have a bunch of imports here, and I'm annotating this class with a Springboot test as well as auto configure mock MVC. A couple of things. Springboot test is indicating to the compiler that this test is associated with Springboot. So we're going to have that framework in mind, as well as we are going to mock an MVC server. So what this does is that it will create a mock of our server. So whenever we hear the word mock, we're really just isolating some resources so that we can test it. Right? So in this case, think of it as just running a server that has the same functionality of what we wrote, but it's not really running in production. It's not even running in localhost. So I'm going to save this, and let's take a look at the couple of things here. So AutoWire a mock MVC object. I'm also going to AutoWire a post controller. So we have our controller here. And the first thing we'll do is to test that our controller is not null. Okay, so this is a good strategy just to indicate whether or not this controller has been wired properly. So the first real test is it should add a post. Actually, this should be called should add and view a post. You'll see that down here in a second. So the first thing we'll do is create a new object instance of a post. So I'm just going to have the title as my blog post, and then my content, right, as the content. And what we'll do in these two lines, 38 and 39, is we'll create an object mapper to change its content into JSON. Okay, so basically this write value as string, and this object allows us to be able to change this object instance into a JSON object so that I can send it as part of the body. All right, so next you can see that for this mock MVC, so the mock MVC is this mock MVC object that we've auto-wired in here, and this is kind of like our fake server. I'm going to perform a post command on add post. All right, so let's take a look at that. So I'm going to send a post command to add post, and what this does is it just adds the post, this new post, to this posts list. Okay, so I'm just adding this new item to this posts list, and I'm going to set the status of the response to created. So this is actually a 201. Okay, so I'm going to check in a second whether this is actually 201, and I'm also returning the new post, and this is going to be returned as a JSON object. So I'm going to come over here and just double check that. I'm going to check that the content is, oh, sorry, this is sending the JSON content, and then I'm going to set the content type as application JSON, and then I'm going to expect is created. I'm going to expect that the response is a 201, and I'm going to expect the content to be this. So we have the title, my blog post, and then the content as my content. Right, so this is exactly what we're being returned when this is successful. Right, when we've successfully added this new post into our posts list, this is what we're going to return. So I'm going to assert that this is what I'm seeing. All right, then the next part of this is I'm going to perform another operation, this time a get operation to view posts. So again, let's take a look at view posts. So view posts, all it does is that it returns the posts. Okay, so again, if we take a look at this, I'm going to expect that the status is okay. So this time it's going to be a 200 code that I'm expecting. And I'm going to expect also the content to be this, right? Because really we only have one post. So this is going to give me an array of just one post. Now, of course, we can actually, in a real test, maybe add a few posts in here and assert that what we're getting back is actually an array of several posts. I think for the purpose of what we're doing, this should be enough. All right, so if we run this test, this should do all of this and making sure that all of these things are asserted to be true. All right, so if we run this, we'll find that we actually have an error. Now this is done on purpose because I wanted to show you that right here it says fail to load application context. Okay. Now if we take a look at our application properties right here, I've actually left out the data source URL. I just wanted to show you that if that's the case, our database does not connect, our application doesn't spin up. This is the error that we're going to get. Okay, so instead I'm going to change it back to what I had before and save it. And let's jump back to our test and let's run it again. Okay, and you'll see this time it actually runs everything. So everything looks good. We have asserted this behavior that we're looking for. So we're pretty happy with this one. So this is an example of a REST controller test. All right, let's take a look at the last type. If we go over to our users controller, so remember in our last video, we created a post mapping for login. So this is getting the data of a name and a password, and then I'm checking the repo for the name and the password to see if there's any matches. If there is a match, then we're going to redirect over to a protected page. Okay, so I want to test this behavior as well as one of the earlier endpoints that we wrote, which is for users view. So if you remember what happened here, this is getting all of the users in our database, and we're just going to go to this user/show_all. And I'm just going to show you one thing very quickly. Take a look at this user repo. We're calling this function called findAll. Okay, so when we call this function findAll, we want to be able to find all of the users. This is mimicking a database call, which is in our users repository. So what I want to do is instead of actually calling the users repository and getting real database data, I want to be able to mock this user repository. So once again, let's just start a test. And again, just for the purposes of saving time, I am going to just copy this test that I wrote earlier. And once again, you see that we have Springboot test, we have auto configure mock MVC. We've also auto-wired our MVC object, mock MVC object. At this time, we're going to create a mock bean, which is user repository. All right, so this user repository is we're going to fake any responses that are coming back from this user repository. So we can once again isolate. So whenever we're mocking something, we want to isolate this part of the application. All right, so if we test our test get all users, I'm going to, again, test this endpoint here, get all users. And notice what we're going through is we're calling a find all, and then we're simply returning the user/show_all. So I'm going to come over here and I'm going to create two test users. Okay, so the first test user we'll call Bobby, and password is 1234. And then we have Jane, and the password is 1234 again. And then we have the size and so forth. So we're going to add both of these users to a list called users. All right, so here is the mimic that we're going to have for the user repository. Now notice that this user repository here is a mock bean. So this is not a real user repository, but when the user repository calls find all, I want to return instead users. I don't want you to do what you usually do with the database, but instead I just want you to return this users. Okay, so then I want to perform a get operation on /user/view. So again, take a look here. We have a /user/view, right? And we want to expect that the status is okay. So we're getting a 200. And then I want to expect that the view that's generated, the template that I'm looking for would be users/show_all, which again, that is the one that we want, right? So that is the one that we're returning. The second thing that we're going to expect in this case is that we're going to have a US property. So this US property is the model associated with this. And we're going to expect that it has the name property, which is Bobby, the password property, which is 1234, and the size property, which is 42. So if we scroll up here, that is in fact one of the users that's here. Okay, so this is, I guess, a test for all of the functionalities that's in the user's view. Now, if we take a look at this test, you might be saying, well, wait a minute. Getting the template here is pretty obvious because after we run this method, we are returning user/show_all. So this seems pretty obvious. But in some other cases, like if we take a look down here with our post mapping login, you see that there's two alternatives, right? So there's an alternative where we pass in a name that is not found in the database, in which case we are going to return back to our login template. But there's another scenario where we have actually somebody that we found in the database, in which case we can now navigate them to the protected resource. Okay, so let's take a look at this workflow, and you can probably guess we can write two tests, one for each part of this if statement. Now again, I want you to see that we have the find by name and password here, and so we're going to mock that in this next test. So I'm going to test a login that's a successful login. Okay, so here is what I enter. So let's pretend that the user has entered Bobby and 1234. Okay, that is a valid entry, and I'm going to make a list of users only containing this person. So when the user repository calls find by name and password, it then returns just the user's list. And I want you to see that in this case, the name and password are pretty useless because we're just sending those in as parameters, but we're not actually checking against the database. We are just checking when there's valid users that are sent back, whether the status is sent as okay, and more importantly, whether we are directed to the user/protected endpoint. Now, you could probably guess that the next test that I want to write is a test where we have an empty array of users and to see if we are redirected to the login template. All right, so I'll leave that as an exercise for you. I hope this has been helpful. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.